Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Erich Schwartzel of the Wall Street Journal, author of the terrific book that came out last year, Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy. Hi, Erich. Nice to see you.
Hi, Diane. Good to be here. Thank you.
I was thinking as we were debating, Chinese spy balloons and this sort of soft culture war that seems to be going on, I thought, I was reminded of your book that came out last year, terrific book, and I thought, what would Erich make of all this right now? Where are we? So I'm going to start with that. Just the environment we're in, is it kind of playing out the way that you spoke about in the book? Just, it really is, to me, a cultural war going on.
It absolutely is. And one thing that the book taught me, Diane, that was so interesting is that the movies and entertainment and culture is this unbelievable proxy for the broader relationship between the US and China. If you really want to understand where the relations between the two countries are, look to the culture and what culture China is allowing in, what culture China is producing itself. And you can actually kind of read into these, science fiction movies or, co-production treaties, quite an understanding, a rich understanding, I would argue, of the geopolitics of the situation too. And so the spy balloon is just the latest chapter in this very bizarre, complicated, kind of codependent relationship between the two countries in the industries that do business in both.
Well, that particular episode actually reminded me of a 1940s very kitschy movie, the spy balloon and the whole sort of terror of all that. But let's talk about the evolution a bit, because I remember when Deng Xiaoping, I believe it was, doesn't matter what color the cat is, black or white, as long as it catches mice. That was a real period of opening. Of course, we had Tiananmen Square, there's that. But there was this sense of an opening up of the economy and this engagement with the world. Let's look at what's it been like under Xi Jinping, because we're certainly seeing a lot more censorship within China, it seems. Is that playing out as well in the movie sphere?
Oh, absolutely. It's night and day. I mean, under Deng Xiaoping is when we started to see the reforms that allowed Western movies into China in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Hollywood had swept the globe throughout the 20th century and turned America into this kind of cultural city on a hill. Most Chinese audiences didn't see any of those movies that the rest of the world did, because after Mao Zedong's revolution, that kind of Western influence was not permitted in any way. Deng Xiaoping's reforms started to change that, and we started to see this kind of economic partnership taking place. One that I think it's critical to remember was seen as kind of the first step toward a democratic reform too. I mean, everyone from Bill Clinton to Rupert Murdoch at that time was arguing that these kind of deepening economic ties would inevitably lead to democratic reform. And what we've seen under Xi Jinping is that the cultural arm of the CCP is becoming an essential arm of his kind of more aggressive, militaristic approach toward running the country. So under Xi Jinping, China's kind of propaganda machine has been running at full force. And we've seen also the spigot of Western influence really tightened. So whereas maybe 10, 12 years ago, you might see Hollywood movies and other forms of Western entertainment flowing into China more freely, now it's a much tougher proposition. And we see companies kind of much more beholden to the whims of the CCP and where the wind is blowing than they were before Xi took office.
Well, it's interesting because the word propaganda to me immediately evokes all-out war. I think of Frank Capra and sort of, us versus them, which value system will win. And it's interesting, even if you think about how it's playing out, let's say in Africa, where there's been a lot of investment from China. We seem to be seeing the same sort of using that as a way in for Chinese sort of cultural products too, right? You mentioned it in the book. Where are we with that?
Well, I love that you mentioned Frank Capra, because Frank Capra, it kind of epitomizes the playbook that Hollywood built and exported around the world. And China has seen that and studied that and wants to do it themselves. And so when I started this book, a lot of people in entertainment here in Los Angeles would say to me, well, Chinese movies are never going to work because no American's ever going to go see a Chinese movie. And there's probably a point to be made there, right? We Americans have never really flocked to foreign films. So I actually started thinking, well, where it's a big world out there. I mean,
Yeah.
there are other audiences beyond Americans, and you're right that Africa, I think, is where we're going to see a lot of this kind of cultural battle play out, because China, as we know, is already there in a major way when it comes to infrastructure and political influence and economic influence. But what I was surprised to learn more about was the cultural campaign being waged there. So I focused on Kenya, and I went to Kenya and spent some time there. And I traveled to these villages far outside Nairobi, and I would knock on their door in the middle of the day,
Mm-hmm.
unannounced, and say, can I come in and talk to you? And I'm not exaggerating. I walked in and a Chinese soap opera was playing on TV,
Was
or
it in
Chinese.
Swahili or was it in like dubbed into English? Like how were they consuming it? Because it wouldn't have been Mandarin.
Well, so actually a critical question, because most Western entertainment companies working in Africa have decided that it is not worth the money to dub their films and TV shows into Swahili,
Mm-hmm.
and so they subtitle them often. Now, the Chinese are not there really with an economic goal in mind; they're there with a political goal in mind, and they have decided to stomach the cost of dubbing their films and TV shows into Swahili, because they know it will make them more appealing than the subtitled American film and TV shows. And so these villages often receive low cost satellite dishes built and manufactured in Beijing that come with Chinese TV shows and movies on them, and entire channels dedicated to Chinese
It's
entertainment. So it's kind of introducing a lot of Africans to the country that has seemingly overnight appeared in their backyard.
it's almost evocative of the Cold War, isn't it? In terms of, I mean, I don't remember a lot of Russian TV trying to be thrown at us, but still, it does feel like, is this really a race for resources? I mean, we we'll get back to the spy balloon because there's a whole but in terms of what's happening in places like Africa and these spheres of influence as well, obviously within Asia, it really is about building alliances, isn't it? With the goal of frankly being most favored nation in terms of who you trade with.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you can draw a direct line between the movies and TV shows and what they portray about life in a particular country, and the set of values that each country is trying to export around the world. So if you talk to in Kenya, where I spent most of my time, if you talk to politicians there, if you find certain politicians, especially more socially conservative politicians, they'll say, I love importing movies from China because they've already been censored, and I don't need to worry
Right.
about impure Western values polluting my nation. And I think for a lot of these countries that are trying to graduate beyond what is known as the developing world, they look at China's last 40 years and they see a model, right? I mean, you referenced Deng Xiaoping, right? There's a model there. There's an explosive economic growth that a lot of these countries would love to replicate themselves. And so if the debate is between the US and China right now, especially after several years of US retrenchment, it's becoming an easier call.
Well, let's talk about it flows both ways. And so, China's always, I think it was Kissinger that said China has a lot of possibility and it will always have a lot of possibility. So take that as you may. But, let's talk about the role, for example, of then Vice President Joe Biden. And what impact did he have on that whole sort of cultural trade, so to speak?
He was critical because it's kind of hard to imagine, because we know that China is such a massive country, but whenever they started seeing Hollywood films in the 1990s, it was a dramatically under-screened country. There were not a lot of movie theaters being built.
Right.
That started to change with the urbanization of the country as a whole, because there was this mass urbanization campaign to move people from rural communities into cities, and the cities needed movie theaters. So there was this explosion in screen count. And so the market started to grow exponentially around 2008, 2009, and Hollywood started to wake up to it. And then in 2012, then Vice President Joe Biden and then Vice Premier Xi Jinping met in Los Angeles, and they negotiated a new treaty that was essentially going to more than double the number of Hollywood movies allowed into China every year. So suddenly you had this kind of perfect confluence happening where China's building more screens and expanding its market that way. And then suddenly studios see a world where almost all of their major big summer blockbusters could get into China as well under this new agreement. And so it was seen at the time, this is now 10, 11 years ago, a very different political moment, seen at the time of this sort of deepening of the economic ties. And I think in some corners, try maybe like a possibility to seen as a possible way into influencing Chinese attitudes. And as you said, hearts and minds.
Well, it's, these players do emerge in new forms as presidents, for example. And Bob Iger came to mind as I was reading the book, because he obviously at one point was going to be the U.S. or potential U.S. ambassador to China. He's now currently CEO of Disney again. That China was a win for him, was it not? Has that sort of, we're now seeing, I think Marvel movies start to stream in to China again now that he's back in that role. Can you talk a little bit about Disney and, where it's ranked relative to its rivals?
I mean, I think there's no question that they have had the most success in China. They have basically reared an entire generation of Chinese children on Marvel superheroes and Pixar characters, and they're selling 1 million toys there. They're selling tons of tickets, right? Mm-hmm. When times are good. They've even built a theme park that cost more than $5 billion to put up outside of Shanghai. Mm-hmm. I would argue, though, that success is more of a vulnerability today than ever, because when the geopolitical winds shift, Disney is caught in the middle, and an investment that's
much like they've been in Florida, by the way, so it's not unique to China, right?
Well, it's an interesting parallel. It's an interesting parallel to draw, and I think for a long time, Chinese politics was kind of out of sight, out of mind to most shareholders, but that's not the case anymore. And I think a lot of businesses are waking up to the possibility that we could see a world. I mean, look at what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine, mm-hmm. and all business ties to Russia had to be severed almost immediately. In a world where something like that happened with China, it would be hugely consequential for the bottom line of a company like Disney. So yes, absolutely, they rushed into it, and they did everything they could to protect their presence there, whether it was censoring movies or agreeing to certain economic terms with state-owned businesses and state-owned entities. Absolutely, they did whatever it took to have the presence they have there now. But I think going forward, if tensions continue to rise between the two countries, companies like Disney are really going to be caught in the middle. And I think it's interesting that at one point, Bob Iger thought that his experience in the business of China qualified him to be ambassador to China, but it's pretty clear by the choice of the Biden administration in terms of who they put in there that it was not going to be an administration where that relationship was defined necessarily economically.
Right. It's not sort of embracing each other in Los Angeles by a movie theater sort of thing. One thing we focused on a lot here at Forbes is TikTok. So I know we're talking a lot about the movie studios and that experience of streaming, et cetera. Interesting, by the way, that Netflix has been more critical of China, and it, much like the Chinese model, they have their own Netflix, so it doesn't have the same skin in the game. But let's talk about TikTok a bit, because there's been so much concern here. This is a Chinese parent. It's the most popular platform for Gen Z. How is that playing out in terms of what you cover and the content angle?
I mean, I think the content angle is critical here. I mean, this is such a soft power win for China, the fact that so many, especially young people in the US, are addicted to TikTok as they are. I think, there's been quite a bit of concern around the data that may or may not be harvested on TikTok and where it goes and who has access to it. I think by phrasing your question, though, about the content, I think it identifies something that I think has been underappreciated, which is that TikTok's algorithm is controlling how millions of users see certain types of videos and what types of videos surface and what types of videos have the capacity to spread widely and go viral. And I think that there's been an underappreciation for just how easily that could be tweaked to not only make sure that certain kinds of messaging is not surfacing, but that certain kinds of messaging is, right? So a world where there have been some high profile stories about videos concerning like the third rails of Chinese politics, right? Like Taiwan or Tibet or Tiananmen, that kind of content seeing, a kind of having a kind of disappearing. But I think it's also worth looking at what kind of content is being risen to the top. Like, is there a world where certain, geopolitical adversaries of China, suddenly TikTok users in those countries start seeing content critical of their own governments? Or is there a way for TikTok to just
basically weaponizing the platform and the content within it?
Right, and just sort of sowing discord of all kinds so that everything seems a little amiss and there's just a lot of static to sort through.
What else is on your radar right now? You mentioned, of course, what's going on in China and, Uyghurs going into re-education camps. So there is a bit of a moral impetus to some extent when you think about some of the issues that we hear about. And of course, here in the U.S., we have our own issues. But how do you see this playing out? Is the spy balloon at all relevant? I started with that. Do you see this as emblematic of the mindset from Beijing and how it's continuing?
I think so, in a way, because I think if you read state media out of China, there's this kind of mocking tone that's been taken that I think speaks to a swagger that is relatively new to Chinese politics and is worth paying attention to. And then there's also there's like a tendency to very quickly point out that what China is doing with its spy balloon is not much different than what the U.S. does with its spying capacities too. There's a kind of equating of the two that I think is probably, I'd have to imagine, catching on and persuading a lot of Chinese people of the role their government should have in the world. I mean, in general, I remember I spoke when I was reporting the book to someone who worked on the 2008 Beijing Olympics, and
that was a real coming out moment, ceremony. Wasn't it? Yeah.
Right, and he said something that's always stuck with me. He said you could practically hear the sound of China beating its chest and saying that this is its moment, its time had come, and that stuck with me as I was reporting the book, because you can see it everywhere. And like I said, I was looking at the movies, and suddenly you start watching Chinese movies with that idea in mind, and you start to think, well, this is basically the cultural equivalent of what the U.S. went through in Ronald Reagan's America, a kind of like unabashed patriotism and unabashed tendency and unabashed ability to say, this is our way of doing things and we're not going to apologize for it. In fact, you should adopt it, right? And so I think we're seeing a kind of parallelism there where it feels like China is in that moment now where it feels its sort of elevation, it's been biding its time, and it's not going to apologize for it.
Great. I think there's a lot more to come. So thanks for joining us, Erich.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.